So Baron got up there.
Very pretty good.
It was a
Food.
Good to go.
That is all people need to know. That is all people need to know.
He was actually very good.
Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today. My name is Sheriff Henderson, and I'm president of the Minnesota AFL-CIO, with over 1,000 affiliated union locals who represent more than 300,000 working men and women in this state. When Minnesota's next governor takes office, he should have two key priorities in mind. The first should be helping create family-sustaining jobs for the middle class. The second priority should be addressing the state's multi-billion-dollar budget crisis. And we have to remember, in balancing that state budget, we must protect our school kids, our seniors, and the job creation tools that we need. However, middle-class families these days can no longer afford to have the budget balanced on their backs with higher property taxes and more fees. Middle-class Minnesotans are already paying more than their fair share. Now, we know that Mark Dayton will balance the budget in a fair and responsible manner that protects middle-class families. However, we wanted to examine whether or not Tom Emmer and Tom Horner would balance the budget on the backs of the middle class. That's why we've turned to respected tax analyst Jeff Van Wycke to do what he does best, to run the numbers. And so, Jeff, you ran the numbers. What did you find out?
Thank you, Sheriff. I'll do the spelling of the name quick. My name is Jeff Van Wyken. That's J-E-F-F. Last name Van Wyken. V-A-N space capital W-Y-C-H-E-N. N. Both the Emmer and the Horner proposals contain tax increases. Let's start with the Emmer property tax proposal, which is more than a number than an actual proposal. Representative Emmer would cut $1.15 billion from property tax aids and credits, but he doesn't tell us how he would make these cuts. However, it's likely that at least a portion of these cuts will translate into property tax increases. This view is supported by the actions of none other than Tom Emmer himself, who, as a Delano City Council member, voted to increase property taxes to, quote, fill the hole caused by state aid cuts. The Minnesota Department of Revenue and nonpartisan House and Senate analysts assume that 2/3 of aid cuts will translate into property tax increases and 1/3 will translate into cuts to local government budgets. If we apply this assumption to the Emmer proposal, the $1.15 billion cut will translate into a $700 to $800 million property tax increase in the next biennium. And this does not take into account the potential county property tax increases resulting from Health and Human Service cuts, or to potential school property tax increases due to Representative Emmer's school aid freeze, which has no adjustment either for inflation or for school enrollment growth. Next, let's look at Mr. Horner's sales tax proposal. In order to generate the amount listed in the Horner budget proposal and still lower the sales tax rate by 1%, it will be necessary to expand the sales tax to include a wide variety of goods and services that are currently untaxed, including not just clothing, but eyeglasses, baby products, caskets, cemetery ground maintenance, school books, sewer and water services, capital equipment, farm machinery, including both repair and replacement parts, firefighter protective equipment, consumer legal and accounting services, investment counseling, car repair, funeral services, haircuts, and dozens of other goods and services. Even after the rate reduction, the Horner proposal would result in an estimated $2.1 billion increase in the next biennium. If all 87 Minnesota counties adopt Mr. Horner's optional county sales tax, the total sales tax increase will be about $3.1 billion. The Horner proposal does contain a $350 million sales tax credit, which would reduce the net property tax increase to $2.75 billion. Chair?
Thanks, Jeff. Now you know the numbers. Property tax increases and sales tax increases, they affect the middle class. Frankly, the middle class is already bearing the burden of regressive taxes. So, and to speak to this is how that's affecting middle class families across the state is Laura Askelin. Laura is the president of the Southeast Area Labor Council. Laura?
Thank you, President Knudsen. For the last 8 years, Minnesota has had budget crisis after budget crisis. And to temporarily balance those budgets, Governor Pawlenty has time and time again turned to the middle class to bear the burden. In Rochester alone, we've seen property taxes go up by nearly $100 million in the last 8 years. Statewide, that's over $3 billion that has been shouldered on the backs of middle-class families and seniors on fixed incomes. As I talk to my friends and neighbors back home, they tell me they cannot afford to pay an even larger share of their income taxes than the rich. Tom Emmer and Tom Horner's tax increases will make our tax system even more unfair. Thank you.
We've all seen the impact of property tax increases. But what will a nearly $3 billion sales tax increase on things like Jeff talked about, what will that mean? Well, we've invited Adam Evanstead, who is a meat cutter with Festival Foods, to tell us what it will mean to his family.
Thanks, sir. My name is Adam Evanstead. It's Adam like Adam, Evenstad. And I'm a middle-class American. I bought a house last September. I got married a couple months ago. During this election, I'm hearing things about increases in property taxes and increases in sales taxes. You know, I'm trying to get my wife through college essentially on just my income so that we can progress in our lives. And when I start thinking about having to pay more for my home and paying more for virtually everything else that I consume, it creates a pretty scary landscape. I have friends that are out of work. You know, I could possibly be out of work next week. If these increases happen, you know, what happens to me if I do lose my job? Thank you.
Throughout this campaign, Tom Emmer and Tom Horner have been trying to scare Minnesotans on the tax issue. However, the facts and figures are clear, and they speak for themselves. Tom Emmer and Tom Horner would both raise taxes on middle-class Minnesotans. Mark Dayton is the only candidate for governor who will protect the middle class. Now we would take any questions you might have.
Tom Emmer says that all the local governments need to do is cut. They don't, there are plenty of places to cut, he says, and that they can shield their homeowners, their residents from property tax increases if they only have the will to do it.
First thing I would note is that when Councilmember Emmer was on the Delano City Council, he apparently lacked the will that he's now referring to, because he voted for a 16% property tax increase in order to replace what he recalled a hole in the city's budget that resulted from state aid cuts. And it's important to note that the per pupil spending of Minnesota school districts is now below the national average. Based upon Census Bureau data, the per capita spending of city government is also below the national average. There is not this, the notion that there is infinite room for cuts in local government budgets is false. Our local governments have cut far more than state government has cut over the last 8 years. And so consequently, given that our local government spending is below the national average, and given that we know from the standard assumptions used not only by the Revenue Department but by Minnesota Management and Budget, these aid cuts translate into property tax increases. There is not the fat in local government budgets that we can continue to absorb these kind of tax increases perennially year after, or aid cuts, excuse me, perennially year after year.
Jeff, his point is that it's not either this or that, that there can be some mitigating factors here that would allow perhaps more cuts to occur. You just don't agree with that. It's not either or.
Well, more cuts probably will occur, but you will not be able to cut $1.15 billion from local government budgets. For example, city governments across the state, in inflation-adjusted dollars per capita, have cut their revenues 15% from 2002 to 2010. So they are making these cuts. They will continue to make these cuts. But even with these cuts, have not been large enough to replace the aid cuts that have already occurred.
But that's the point. Why do we need to replace the aid cuts that have occurred when the cities are functioning, maybe at a lower level than they were before? But why do you need to replace these aid cuts?
We need to replace the aid cuts because, first of all, some of the cuts that cities made will not be sustainable in the long term. Cities have been drawing down their reserve funds. That can only go on so long. Cities have been cutting back on their infrastructure investments. Again, this saves money in the short term, but in the long term, it will cost taxpayers more as your infrastructure deteriorates. As I noted before, the per capita spending of Minnesota cities and school districts is already below the national average. And there is simply not room for unlimited cuts.
Ms. Knudsen, you mentioned that the two main issues were the budget and also creating family-sustaining jobs for the middle class. What has Senator Dayton told you that you think that there will be family-sustaining jobs for the middle class? How is he going to make sure that those jobs are created over the next 4 years?
He has a number of ways of doing it, and I think it's important that they're family-sustaining jobs. That means that, just what it says, that you can survive as a family without any sort of outside assistance from government or anywhere else. So those are the kinds of jobs that we feel are important. Now, Senator Mark Dayton has promised to do a bonding bill, $1 billion bonding bill. That is good for two reasons. One, the state's infrastructure has been compromised because of a lack of investment. And so that would help get our infrastructure back in the shape it needs to be. But secondly, it would put nearly 30,000 people to work. And those people that are working, they're paying taxes, they're buying more groceries, they're maybe buying some clothes for their kids. That secondary spending will help other businesses. We feel it's an economic starter. Along with that, though, he talked about green energy and renewable energy and looking at ways that we can bring more of that industry to Minnesota to make sure that we're building the turbines as well as erecting the turbines. And I think that is going to be another big way to create jobs.
Sheriff, can I
Yes.
just to piggyback onto that question right now. When we have a struggling economy, as we do right now, the last thing you want to do is reduce the aggregate demand. That's what drives the economy is purchases. A lot of those purchases are purchases made by the middle class. If you increase taxes on the middle class, that's what's really going to be hard on an economy that's already struggling, because that's where the purchasing has come from. That's what's driving economic growth is consumer demand. And by middle class tax increases reduce that demand and will hurt the economy even further.
Other questions? No more questions? Well, thank you very much, everyone.